But the main event today, I'm really pleased to welcome Brittany Nickerson to Nicolette Noon. This is her first time, and indeed, this is a new artist. And in fact, there's 3 new people that I'm really pleased to introduce to our community, Brittany being one of them. It's also my pleasure to welcome Godfre and Alexandra. Alexandra will be introduced more fully later, but she's just joined our team in Libraries and Cultural Resources, and her partner Godfre is going to be joining, well, I'm going to introduce Godfre now, joining the Calgary arts community very shortly. So lots of new talent to get to know. Godfre Leung is a critic and curator based between the territories currently known as Vancouver and Calgary. His writing has appeared in magazines such as Art Asia Pacific, Art in America, and C Magazine. He's curated multiple exhibitions, including Pau Hua Her, I hope I'm pronouncing that more or less accurately, Emplotment at the Ore Gallery in 2020, Guesthood and Alienhood, Sun Young Shin, Ginny Yu, Republic and the Other at the Verhotum Press Gallery, and he was on the curatorial team for the Touring Walker Art Center exhibition, International Pop, in 2015. A distinguished curator, to be sure. He is the incoming artistic director of the Bows in Mohkinstsis in Calgary, right in downtown. And although he's coming to us live today from Vancouver, we're looking forward to him joining us here in Calgary and really making his mark on the local art scene. So Godfre, I will turn it over to you to introduce Brittany and Alex, and welcome. It's great to virtually have you here.
Thank you, Michelle, so much for that unbelievably warm introduction and welcome. As Michelle said, I want to acknowledge that the physical location I'm transmitting from today is the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people, and more broadly in what is currently known as Vancouver, which is collectively the unceded territories of the 3 host nations, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I'm grateful to these hosts, as well as those in Treaty 7 territory, whose lands and resources have enabled today's talk and discussion. Thank you again to Michelle, to Marla, and to the Nickel Galleries for their generosity and collegiality in hosting us all here today. I'll introduce both speakers now so that Britt's artist talk can segue right into a discussion with Alex. Brittany Nickerson is a lens-based artist living and working in Mohkinstsis, which is colonially known as Calgary. She was born on the traditional unceded territory of the Wəlastəkewiyik Maliseet people. In 2014, she graduated from the Alberta University of the Arts with a Bachelor in Design. She completed a Master of Fine Arts from Emily Carr University in 2017. Since 2018, she has served as a programming coordinator of the New Gallery, an artist-run center in Mohkinstsis, Calgary. Her current work is being supported by the Bows and the Canada Council for the Arts. Sorry, that's my cat moving my camera. Alexandra Alisauskas is a learning and engagement librarian at the University of Calgary and a recent graduate of the MAS-MLIS program at the School of Information at the University of British Columbia, pursuing the First Nations curriculum concentration. Alex also holds a PhD in Visual and Cultural Studies from the University of Rochester and was previously an arts writer, researcher, and educator. Her current research explores contemporary art, artists and writers' archives, and person-centered approaches to library, archival, and information services. With Jennifer Douglas and Devin Mardell, she is co-author of the article, Treat Them with the Reverence of Archivists, Records Work, Grief Work, and Relationship Work in the Archives, which was awarded the 2020 W.K. Lamb Prize from the Association of Canadian Archivists. She lives as a grateful guest on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. And I will pass you all off to Brittany.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Godfre, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It means so much. I can see some folks I know real well and some new folks in the participants chat. So nice to see everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Nickel Galleries, Michelle, Marla, Godfre, and Alex, who have been so generous in assisting me with the program today. I was introduced as Brittany. I do prefer to go by Brit, and I use she, they pronouns. I'm a grateful guest in Mohkinstsis, which is colonially known as Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. And I just want to mention that I'll be discussing personal grief and loss today. And I know right now is a really, really difficult time with tremendous amounts of anxiety for lots of folks. So please take care in whatever way is best for you. If you need to leave, obviously, please feel free to do so. I'll be sharing some past works as well as some current in progress works. I'm currently the artist in residence at the Bows. So I'll be sharing some work in progress, which will all kind of offer some greater context to my practice, which if I had to reduce to a single sentence, uses lens-based mediums and gestures of care to question patriarchal structures of archiving. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. So I hope it works. Okay, yeah, that seems to be working. So if there's any issues, just please jump in and let me know. I started working with photography and other lens-based mediums during my undergraduate degree at AU Arts. My program was very design orientated. It was quite a bit different than other art schools' photography programs. And I'll admit that the kind of rigid structure of the program and kind of the aesthetic expectations from that program certainly have informed my practice today. And I don't always think that's necessarily a good thing. It also kind of pushed forward the kind of problematic idea of placing productivity at the top of the hierarchy, which is still something I'm working through. During my time at AU Arts, probably my second or third year, I started working with more fine arts lens-based professors, and I became very interested in the link between memory and representation in photographs. I wondered then, and I still wonder, about the ability for images to be traces of a collective history and tangible representations of memory and moment. One thing I think about a lot is, I'm sure everyone's seen the movie Back to the Future. Marty McFly, the main character, carries a family photograph of himself and his siblings to keep a constant for his existence as he meddles with the timeline. And for me, that really kind of hit home the idea that a photograph has been so ingrained to represent our literal representation of our existences and our memories. And as someone who works with cameras and works with archives and found imagery, I also often consider the proliferation of digital images and the ubiquity of the technology. You know, a camera is not just an art medium, it has pervaded our daily lives. And I think about that a lot, about outside of my art applications as well, how a camera is used as a tool in many different ways. Okay, I'm just trying to change the slide here. Oh, there we go. Before starting my MFA at Emily Carr, I lost my grandmother to pancreatic cancer. Her name was Marilyn, and in many ways, she was like another mother to me. I spent a lot of my time growing up living with her, and I had a lot of difficulty coping with her death, and this grief caused a significant shift in both my life and art practice. And at the time, that was not a conscious shift, but now looking back and I have more perspective, I understand how that event shifted my life and my work. Grief is a universal experience, but I think we all experience it very differently. And in a lot of ways, I've been experiencing it through my art practice. After she passed away, I began looking through my family's photographic archives. In her basement is a massive collection of images and slides that date from the late 19th century until probably like the mid 2000s. Seeing her after she passed in so many moments of her life through these images allowed me to connect with her even after her death. And cataloging and incorporating these images into my practice has really been a form of grief work for me. Our relationship has not ended or remained static. It is evolving now, even after her death, as I continue to work with her images and images of her and of my family. And in my own way, I think my work with this archive and with her images is a form of care for myself and for my loved ones. The family archive distinguishes itself from other archives as it's passed down through a generation of relatives, generally for the sake of posterity. Very rarely are family archives preserved in accordance with what we might call archival standards. Old film slides are shoved in shoeboxes, 4x6 prints are glued inside books, and they are sealed away in yellowing plastics. One quote I really like from Charles Mayweather says that photography is critical to the practice and authority of the archive. It folds together history as representation and representation as history. The archive gains its authority to represent the past through an apparent neutrality, whereby difference is either erased or regulated. In many ways, I think that photography might be perceived as an objective medium. It's technology capturing simply what is in the frame. But while looking through this archive and subsequently making my work, I was often thinking about the assemblage of archives, in particular my family's archives, who collects and presents these images, who controls the narrative presented, why some images but not others. Looking through my family's archives, I found many images and newspaper clippings featuring male achievement. It led me to wonder who created this archive and how their subjectivity in presenting a collective history lent itself to greater patriarchal structures. I feel a particular longing to discover figures in the archive that are limited by the conventions of static images and their historical contexts. So in terms of actually incorporating these images or materials into my work, that began during my MFA. And all throughout my time, this was a very contentious choice, mostly with my thesis supervisor. I was often questioned on how folks could relate to my work because of the deeply personal source material. At that time, I was also incorporating poetic writings into my thesis, which kind of pushed against the kind of expectations of academic structure. And so through my thesis and my work, I was kind of pushing back against that narrative. Because for me, I think the personal can be political, and these photographs revealed the structures which make up a patriarchal society with its sexual, racial, and class divisions. I feel a lot of my earlier works in my family's archive, particularly this one, weren't necessarily successful in conveying the conceptual frameworks of my current practice. But this kind of assemblage, which features archival materials, but also uses Google Street View screenshots, family snaps, you know, there's like I don't know if anyone else recognizes the Pride and Prejudice VHS cover, handwritten notes to my grandmother. All of these things kind of coalesced and were tangible materials for me to work through my grief and to create a record of my experience. And while I do say that I don't necessarily think this work is successful, I've also spent the last couple years trying to move away from that kind of binary classification of success and failure. Sometimes things just, they are what they are. And looking back, I feel like this work was really critical for me as it led me down a path I didn't anticipate. And it's also acted as a kind of souvenir or moment for my ongoing experience with grief. With every work I've made with my family archives, I always start by digitally scanning any materials I wish to use. I actually never work with original images. I always print new copies. I do this for a couple reasons, and the most major reason being that I have a deep respect for the actual original images. They were not taken by me or collected by me, and they're not mine to destroy. My intention with my work is not to erase the history, but to present a counter archive or a new narrative that can one day maybe sit alongside the original source materials. I also feel a deep responsibility to steward and preserve these images, because at the end of the day, it is my own collective history, and I do want to treat it with deep care. This work on the screen is called Untitled Clusters. It was part of my MFA thesis. It's a 12-foot by 3-foot installation consisting of fragmented freestanding images, all of which have been sourced from either my family's or my own archive. Subjects and moments are deconstructed from their image context and placed into a new narrative. I began by pulling female figures into this work. I wanted to cut away my own patriarchal history to construct new narratives for the omitted or forgotten. This work is a way to contextualize my own relationship with my collective history that addresses purposeful admissions. It aims to create a process of remembrance from absence. And in a wider context, my practice addresses the problematic classifications of how we perceive and interpret history. It recovers and recontextualizes voices that were forgotten within the photographic archive. I think one thing I'm pretty commonly asked is, out of, like thousands and thousands of images, why I choose certain moments or subjects. So why some and not others? And I've never really been able to like rationalize this choice, I think, in the way that is satisfying, at least not yet. Certainly, I'm led by my own subjectivity and lived experiences, and I often think of Roland Barthes' term punctum when assembling my collages. So the thing that like pricks me, there's just something inside me that says like, this is the image I want to use. And maybe that can be attributed to nostalgia or grief or longing. I'm not really sure, but yeah, that's a question I'm often asked. With this particular work, I also wanted to move away from the kind of typical pictorial frame in photography, so the typical square or rectangle. And I also wanted to visually reference a timeline, so like the historical aesthetics of time passing, kind of alluding to a collective history or passing of time. It's difficult to see in these pictures because they're not in person. It's a little bit easier to see them when you're physically in the space, but when I'm scanning images, I actually don't make any kind of corrections to the scanned images. I don't like remove any dust or scratches, and I hardly do any color correcting. I'll go into that a little bit later with my conversation with Alex, but also when I installed this work, it was important for me for the work to be several inches off the wall, giving it a shadow. I often use the shadow as kind of an ongoing visual choice in my work, and as an important element of my autoethnographic methodologies. For me, a shadow is both tangible and ephemeral, and it acts as a trace or a kind of temporary index of movement or moment. And I want these shadows to act as a trace of my intervention in these archives, or kind of a way of creating my own mark or identity within this collective history. I guess in this one, you can kind of see on the sepia figure here, this is a newspaper clipping, you can kind of see at the center, there was a fold in the work, which kind of caused like a visual disruption there. This is another work I created during my MFA. It's about 4 feet by 3 feet, so quite large in person. It's called 1976, and it's from a series of 4 images. I created these very large scale collages in my studio with image fragments from the archive, more Google Street View images, Post-it notes, and washi tape. Once the collage was complete, I photographed myself placing the collages in a traditional archive folio. This work and much of my practice is very iterative. Images are scanned, printed, deconstructed, scanned, and rephotographed. And very rarely do I actually display the physical collage materials or like the first portion of my work. For me, I think this process is directly linked to my thoughts on memory and the photograph's intrinsic link to memory. Each time the image is becomes a facsimile, it kind of loses information through the scanning process, the scanning and printing process, which is kind of like memory for me, that each time you reproduce a memory, it is further away from you in time and becomes harder to recall. This is like from the same series, but just kind of closer with more details. Here you can see like the washi tape and Post-it notes being used. For me, this series was a very circular process. I began with my family's archive, and then this work sees me put my own interventions back within it. So that's the choice with the archive folio. The construction of these collages and my attempt to reproduce them is a way to shift my interaction with the archive from one of viewer to participant. It asks how I can contribute to my own family history through material intervention. And in this work and in the previous work, maybe I'll just go back a few, you can see, again, another kind of repeating element in all my work is the use of hands. And these are my hands, and they visually reflect my role in this archive. I want to visually embed my autoethnographic methods, and I want to show both the physical deconstruction that happens in my work, like cataloging and collaging, and the concept of deconstructing flaw or bias within the archive. For me, the use of the hands as well brings to light the interventions happening. I don't want to sort of be like invisible in the work, or I don't want my interventions to be invisible. And I don't necessarily want to change the history, but I certainly want to emphasize the omissions within it, especially in a broader social context of using archives as a power system to diminish the achievement or representation of oppressed communities. This is an install shot of a work called Performance Frame, which consisted of 33 image fragments presented in a vitrine. These are deconstructed images pulled from a video in which I bound a photograph with tape. This work, again, is less concerned with the content of the actual image and more focused on the intervention as an act of care in my archive. So after graduating from Emily Carr, my practice has certainly been a lot more sporadic. I took on a job after my MFA as a cultural worker at the New Gallery, which has been so incredibly rewarding. But I'm sure, as most people who do cultural work or artwork know, that you divert a lot of your creative and artistic energy to the role. So I certainly haven't been making as much work as I had in the past. I've also been finding it really hard, like I'm sure most people with the pandemic, to just want to do anything, including making work. But I guess on the plus side, I've also been carving out time for non-art activities that have always been an outlet and a safe space for my queerness, in particularly Dungeons and Dragons. And in my youth, before I even understood my own identity, I found space to intersect with play and queerness through D&D. Becoming a blank slate to create your own character and role play gives you a lot of agency. And that was kind of my first experience going into a community that was very cis male dominated, which was incredibly difficult at times, but I've found great success in playing with fellow LGBTQ folks. I'm not here to go on a tangent about D&D, but I do love it, and it's definitely informed my work and helped me really lean into my queer identity. So finally, I'll talk about some of the work I'm doing right now, which is all very, very, very in progress, as I just started my residency at the beginning of September. I'm currently at the Bows, which is an artist-run center in Mohkinstsis. So I don't actually have any fully completed works to share, but I'll kind of share what I'm working on. And I don't actually usually share in-progress works outside of a formal kind of critique structure. So I feel a little bit vulnerable about this because they're not like done. So the conceptual framework of my project and research is a continuation of my ongoing research, which questions patriarchal structures of archiving. These artworks are certainly leaning more now in towards my own identity as a queer woman and using gestures of care. Currently, I'm working on 2 larger pieces. The first, which you can see here, is a long collage work. This is probably only about actually a third of the work, because it's actually about 10 feet long. So it's not really possible to show the full work on a computer screen, unfortunately. So images have been scanned, printed, collaged, rescanned, and then arranged in a file that you're looking at. This is also, I think, the first piece I've made that incorporates very clearly images outside of my family's archive. So they're actually images that I've taken, and I think that this new development is important. And as the archivist, I'm trying to also embed my own experiences into this collective history. My intention for this work is that it'll eventually be printed on one long kind of piece of delicate fabric, probably about 10 to 15 feet, depending on how much longer I work on this. And then it'll be hung in the gallery. And then the last piece I'll show y'all. This is the second thing I have in progress, and this is even less complete than the last one. Here I'm composing a still life constructed of image fragments. I'm also including flowers. I'll be using orchids. For me, they're impossible to separate from my grandmother. When she passed, all of the orchids in her home lost their blooms. And for me, that will always kind of remind me of the profound grief and sadness I felt. I'd also plan on using lavender, which is a plant that is kind of inseparable from queer history and experience. And then everything will be arranged in a still life and captured using medium format photography. This kind of seemingly random assemblage of imagery, like a hand holding a shell and a blurry snapshot of fireworks and a landscape of somewhere I don't really know, are used to present a counter archive, an alternative family history through a queer femme lens. And that's everything I have for now. So thank you so much. I'm gonna actually pass it off to Alex next. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Sure, thanks, Britt. And thanks to Godfre and Michelle for having me as well. We had, I think there's a lot of resonances with the work I've been doing kind of in my scholarship on archival theory and with Britt's work. So I'm really excited to be here, and thanks so much for sharing. So yeah, although I'm a librarian now, during library school and sort of more generally in my art history research, I've been interested in artists and archives and the emotional dimensions of archival work and archival labor. And yeah, we're just gonna have a little, I guess, conversation, Britt, about your practice and kind of some intersections in our interests. So maybe I'll start with a question about how you see your role as an archivist or family. I think you called yourself elsewhere an artist archivist, family archivist, and really how the role of the archivist is viewed. So in traditional kind of archival theory, or the goal of kind of the archival profession until I think recently has been to kind of view the archivist as this neutral custodian of history, right? So that you don't intervene in the history, you're presenting it for others to interpret. And a major theorist in archive studies, Terry Cook, he has this quote that when I read it, or I remembered it when I was looking at your work. So he writes, quote, "Just as patriarchy required women to be subservient, invisible handmaidens to male power, historians and other users of archives require archivists to be neutral, invisible, silent handmaidens of historical research," right? It's kind of this invisibility of the archivist in the archive. And I'm not sure Cook intended to do so, but I think he's also pointing to the feminization of archival labor and the archival profession, right? It's still a primarily female-dominated profession. And even although you're speaking of kind of a family archive and in a personal archives context outside of an institution, I mean, women are often the caregivers and keepers of archives. This research on personal archives has shown this. And I was also thinking too, when you were talking now about like the role of like the women in the family structure and like documenting the family, right? Like I think there's this movement on Instagram now to keep the mother in the picture, right? That women are so often taking children in themselves and not, or photos of their children and not themselves. So that kind of invisibility of the care work around record keeping, I guess. So sorry, that was a long preamble, but it's just brought up a lot of ideas. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, you mentioned that you're interested in kind of refiguring or rethinking patriarchal structures of archiving. And I think that you taking up this role of archivist is part of that, or at least how I interpret it. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you view that role, how kind of you view your practice and the work you're doing with the Families Archive as rewriting these patriarchal forms of record keeping, I guess. And yeah, I'd just love to hear more about the work you do with your Families Archive. So.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for the wonderful question. So I think when I approached this work, I knew that like neutrality was not really possible because I'm so kind of intrinsically tied to this collective history. And I think that the idea that the archivist should be invisible is certainly an interesting one, and one that when I was looking through my archive, I could see the archivist in a way through the way images were presented or collected. And I think that when I approach this work, I don't try to be neutral. I try to incorporate my own experience and identity in the work I make. And I certainly feel like maybe like almost not conflicted about working in the family archive, but I certainly recognize the biases and the patriarchal structures that exist within archiving. So like you said, family archives and archives in general are generally collected and cared for by women. But when I was looking through the archive, there was kind of like overwhelming male achievement, while images of, female people were generally like in like kind of domestic spaces. So there's just kind of like a very stark difference in the way gender was represented in my archives. So like I do recognize that in the archive, and I was able to recognize that when I was making the work, but I feel conflicted because I also really care for these materials so deeply, and I have a reverence for them, even though they kind of come from this like problematic structure. And as part of this collective history, I do have a very deep desire to care for these materials. And right now, actually, the archive is in the care of my grandfather, who just recently moved into assisted living. So I don't have access to the materials in a way that I typically would. And of course, this is to keep everyone safe. I haven't been able to access them, but I feel like there's like certainly a deep sadness that that the archive is kind of separated from me now. I mean, going forward, my hope is that one day the archive can come into my care, especially as I've been working with it so much. I did notice like after like the mid 2000s, there was quite a dip in contributions to the archive, and I'd love to work with kind of my generation and my family to kind of amend that and keep working with it as an archive. I also think about placing my own artwork in some form in the family's archive alongside those images as kind of this like alternative history, and offering a different perspective. And I spoke about coming into these archives as a way to work through grief, and I certainly felt like, I don't know if anyone else has experiences this, but when you have a loved one who goes into palliative care, there's this overwhelming sadness because the person you love is still there, but you know that everything is changing and ending. And I guess when I took up this work, it was a way to keep the relationship from ending. It's a way to continue that care. And I didn't want our relationship to end with the moment she died. I wanted to continue our kind of ever evolving relationship and learning more about her and learning more about my collective history and what that might mean. So.
Yeah, thank you. I know we had talked about maybe skipping this question, but I think it's really relevant because a lot of the, I'm just thinking the work I've been doing with Dr. Jennifer Douglas that looks at grief and record keeping and the role, like the essential role that like working with records in different ways is a form of grief work. I think you talked a little bit about in the presentation. So for instance, you know, you're the family record keeper. You talk about like your strong emotional connection to the actual materials, right? You manipulate the materials and kind of reframe them and also create, yeah, like creating your own archive of memories too, right? Contributing. So I think, yeah, so it's a way of like continuing the bond with your family members through the records. And I wonder, maybe actually I'll skip that question and think about the idea of kind of materiality, because I think that's part of it too. And the research we did with parents, bereaved parents who use their like children's objects or photographs of their children to kind of continue these relationships, and they viewed kind of record keeping practices as a way, like I said, to maintain that relationship in the absence of a physical body. Bodies and materiality are really key. And I think this is something that recent archival theory is exploring a lot too, especially like queer archival theory. So this one scholar, Marika Seafor, she talks about how the human kind of stains and remains we have in archives, like ink splotches or fingerprints. She's got this great passage about finding this hair of a trans activist that she was going through their archives, and she encountered this hair and had like a really visceral affective bond, right? Like the material connection was really key. And I'm just going to quote for her too, right? So she writes, the promise of animation offered by present bodies and bodily fragments for archival discourses and practices push us to consider more deeply what is absent in archives and how we might critically address and redress such absences. So she's writing, right, that the materiality, the presence of bodies is actually pointing to, like you say, maybe the absence or a counter archive, right? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about materiality in your work. I think it's really, really present in terms of, you talk about like the materiality of the photograph, right? When you're scanning, you don't touch up any scratches, you kind of do not much color correction, any sort of imperfections or traces of time are not eliminated. But I also think too, like your body in the archive, right? Like you mentioned, your hands are visible, your manipulation, your work with it, I think is a kind of the primary, like you said, the process is the subject of this practice. So can you talk maybe a little bit more, sorry, I know that was sort of rambly, but about the materiality of the archive, what opportunities it presents for you, and maybe even draw out kind of this this queering you were talking about too, or an opportunity to explore that aspect?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, part of the reason of like kind of leaving the images alone and not retouching them was at first a way to move away from like this notion of perfection. But I also think it's important for these images to kind of carry their burden of time and material, and kind of show their experiences very evidently. Like images, they crack in time, right? Or they turn yellow, or every time someone pulls one from a page, there's fingerprints, or, it bends slightly because it's adhered to a piece of paper. So I think those moments are really key for me, because it really shows that I'm not really the first person in this archive. I didn't collect this archive, it's not pristine, and it's not my intention to make it that way, but I do want to make my intervention and disruptions apparent through that. I guess one thing I didn't really touch on was like the use of like tape in my work, tape or these like colorful post-it notes as materials. Especially they are obviously on the front of the images and not on the back, or they're used to like adhere the images together in a very kind of visually apparent way. And with that, I'm using those materials to make my disruptions obvious. But I also want to explore those kind of absent representations of femme or queer figures in the archives. And I think like those materials also allude in a way to like memory, because I think they're kind of tied to like the aesthetics of family albums, like, a post-it note you use because you want to remember something, or a washi tape is used as kind of like in like scrapbooking or like photo albums. And so I definitely wanted to reference that aesthetic, but also make my interventions and disruptions very clear. And then in terms of like making space for my own kind of like identity, I think I've been coming into that a lot more post MFA. I think there was a lot of things I wanted to talk about with my thesis, but I was told like to kind of narrow the field a little bit. So I kind of had to drop a lot of the work that I was doing, not drop, but kind of sideline the work I was doing on my own identity as a queer person, but also grief. I think there was a lot of push to make my work, not for me, but not personal. And I do understand that kind of concern about making work so personal that it's really hard to access and understand. But after coming out of that, I think that now it's not possible for me to kind of separate my identity. And with newer work, that's why I've been going through my personal archive and not just my family's archive. And incorporating that work as well as a way to kind of add my own like experiences and memories into this archive. So like, again, maybe even separately from the work I'm making, maybe those images find their way into my family's archive. And it's always interesting because I'm looking at all of these images and there's really no context to a lot of them. There's like, you know, some moments of text on the back, but a lot of the people I don't know or don't recognize, and there's places and, you know, that I don't recognize. And like every trip is kind of the same trip because there's no context anymore. So I'm not trying to create context or like impose a narrative on any figure in particular, but more so just like exploring the idea of absence of figures in kind of a broader social context.
Great, thank you. So maybe I'll ask one more question and then we can open it up for questions from the audience. And maybe I'm thinking about, you talked a little bit about the care work and how you view the care for the archive, your work with the archive as an act of care. And this is definitely something that archival theory and studies is moving more towards in recent years, right? Traditional archival theory and professional practice has sort of dictated that the archivist's duty of care is towards the records and kind of preserving that context that you're talking about, that so that people can interpret it. But recently, scholars like Mary Cassifor, who I mentioned, and Michelle Caswell have been taking more of a feminist standpoint to talk about archiving and archival work as care work, where an archivist is, quote, caregivers bound to records creators, subjects, users, communities through a web of mutual affective responsibility based on radical empathy. So basically an awareness that, you know, archives are these webs of relationships and care. And I'm just wondering if that sort of feminist standpoint resonates with your work. I think it does. And if you could talk a little bit, you mentioned this sort of feeling a sense of responsibility to the materials, but to others, maybe to viewers, that kind of how your work with these materials reflects that, or the kind of work you do to acknowledge these kind of webs of relationships that exist, if that makes sense.
No, for sure, because I think when you think of the word archive, for me, what previously maybe came to mind was like, okay, history or historical context. And I think there's this idea that you know, that presentation was supposed to be kind of just like an objective collection of history, and that's not the case. Every person has their own experiences and approaches everything with a certain subjectivity. And, you know, I've said before, like, I can't separate my experiences from this particular archive. And, you know, that feminist way of archiving you mentioned really does resonate with me because, yeah, one of the main reason I don't work with any originals is to kind of preserve that history, as much as I do have like problems with the structure of it and how it came about. I have such respect and empathy for the subjects in my archive. You know, I have to think about the past, the present, and also the future. They don't just belong to me, they belong to others as well. I don't intend to erase this history because I think that by presenting a counter archive through my work, those conclusions can be drawn when they're kind of side by side. And I also try not to like impose any specific narratives on the figures out of respect, because while I'm of course speaking to like a larger social phenomena through my autoethnographic practice, I also feel that these people are my family, and they all have agency and they have their own stories to tell. So I want to draw attention to absence or maybe like misrepresentation or oppression, but I try not to impose any kind of like full narrative on them, if that makes sense. And then for me, like the responsibility is that this is a shared and collected history, and that, I feel a responsibility to care for it in the same way that it's been cared for in previous generations. I wonder if I'd feel differently if it wasn't a family archive, because when I look at it and the work, I see my loved ones and, my experiences reflected back. I try to care for the archive, and I think that's kind of a reflection of, the love I have for the people in the archive and the love for myself.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's your personal family materials. But I think, even just the work you're doing and representing kind of that affective, physical relationship too, right, draws out kind of, I'm not sure how many kind of other kinds of archives you visited, like in like here at the University of Calgary or wherever, but yeah, it's always, there are always sort of those connections we can find often through, like maybe we see an image of somebody that looks like a family member, or you read a really personal story, right? And what I really appreciate about your work is that while it's focused on kind of your personal archive, it draws out the inherently emotional, intimate connection that we can have with records, right? So thank you. So it's 12:53. Oh, great, we have a question. Okay, how do you regard the discard or leftover pieces? Really interesting, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I think, sorry, Sarah, to clarify, are you referring to the pieces I choose not to use in my work, or are you talking about like the kind of, when I collage the work, the kind of discard of the paper materials? Okay, so like when I'm collaging, yeah, I mean, maybe I'll address both, because I mean, both kind of have an answer. So it's interesting. When I go through the archive, each time I've gone through, there's like things I've kind of passed by or not been as drawn to that I'll later go back to, and I'll be interested in it again, and like the reverse will happen. So I think it's just based on like my experiences and how I'm feeling at the time. So generally when I'm cataloging, I've learned to just catalog everything, because I'll always want to come back to those things. And, maybe my relationship with someone will have changed. So my relationship to the image will have changed. And then in terms of like the information from that's lost in my collages. So like if I cut out a figure, I actually keep all those in a folio, in an archive folio. I even know their reproductions, so the images is still there somewhere in the archive, but I just love being able to flip through and kind of see all these like fragmented figures. And sometimes I come back to them for other pieces, right? So yeah, I'm kind of, when it comes to my art practice, I have a bit of a paper problem. There's just like stacks and stacks and stacks of folios filled with like scraps of paper. So, where everyone can see my work, I'll drop my website, which hasn't been updated recently, because yeah, that's how it happens. And then right now, yeah, okay, thanks, Godfre. Yeah, the work I'm doing now will be at an exhibition at the Bows, which will be at the beginning of 2022. Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. So these are all from my mother's side. And I think this was a result of the grief, because it was my mother's mom who passed away. So I just inherently started working with those materials. And also, I grew up with her, and I felt a very deep connection to her. So, I was actually thinking about this today, about like why I haven't worked with my father's side of the family. I think part of that has to do with access. They live in Fredericton in New Brunswick, so access to those materials would be more difficult and certainly more expensive, but is not something it's not something I'm closed off to. It's just kind of been inherent that working through this grief and this loss, it was through that kind of side of the family. And how it would impact the source material. My mother immigrated here, so there was quite a lot of imagery to work with like, I guess, like places that I have never been or have like never accessed. So for me, that was really interesting to kind of see this history. And also, there's a lot that people don't tell you. And there's a lot of things you don't know, and you might find those things out after people pass away. And I feel that because I wasn't able to talk to my grandmother after she passed, I was able to learn more about her through these archives. And for me, I think that really impacted my practice and my way of moving forward and continuing our relationship.
I'm going to jump in. This has been so great, Brittany and Alexandra. Thank you so much. And Godfre, who's not here, kind of here. I want to thank all of you for bringing Brittany's work to the magic of Zoom today, and to sharing it with, I think, a really dynamic audience. Some great questions. We could have asked many, many more. I've got about 20 that are, swimming around in my head. But thank you for the links to your exhibition to come up, and your web address is in the chat. Is there a way to reach out to you, Brittany?
I was actually just typing that as you said that.
There we go. Perfect.
I dropped my Gmail. If anyone has any questions about art or like whatever, I'll teach you Dungeons and Dragons. It's all cool. You can email me at any time.
Fabulous. Thank you. And Alexandra, thank you so much. It's just great to have you as part of Libraries and Cultural Resources. I'm looking forward to projects. And Godfre, we're just counting down the days till you join us in Calgary, and really looking forward to learning more about your practice